Thank you for joining us on A Mark's Eye View, where I fondly look back on the things that made me a wrestling fan my whole life. Have we got a big show for you tonight? My name is Nathaniel Muir, and I'm the movie editor at AIPT. I'm also a longtime wrestling fan who knows his stuff, sort of. This is my first part of a four-part look at 1990 WCW. Now, when most people say that's so WCW, they are referring to a particular time and specific choices. Those with longer memories will refer to something else entirely. Something so bad it has become a part of wrestling lore. A feud that will invoke understanding with just two words. An angle that managed to define an entire year, even though it began well into it. The Black Scorpion ruined WCW for 1990. But was the year really that bad? WCW started the year off strongly. After a hot 1989, which saw Ric Flair named the Wrestler of the Year by Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the Wrestling Observer, the Four Horsemen were brought back. The same Four Horsemen that were initially formed to protect the Nature Boy from ever losing the NWA World title. Things were a little different this time, and it was pretty cool. As a young fan, I was really interested to see what would happen. Usually, when it comes to powerful stables, they're bad guys. They run roughshod over the company, they win titles, they injure faces, they terrorize announcers, and then eventually all the forces of good come together and they stop this evil force. Now, there are exceptions like Degeneration X, but it's usually evil stables that are what we see running around. This really intrigued me as a kid because you have Olli Anderson, who I had never seen his faces, but the Minnesota Wrecking Crew were a great tag team. You have Sting, who was by far the most popular good guy in the company. And then, of course, Ric Flair, who was the greatest wrestler on the planet. So it just amazed me what it is that they might be able to do in the company. Unfortunately, we never got to see that because Sting ended up challenging Flair for the NWA title. He had won Starrcade '89, the Future Shock tournament, because WCW, like for their biggest event of the year, might as well make a wacky tournament out of it, like Lethal Lottery or Future Shock. Sting won this tournament and he pinned Flair in the process of it, so he felt that he earned a title shot. He made the challenge, and unsurprisingly, on February the 6th, Clash of the Champions 10, Texas Shootout, the Horsemen turned on Sting. Now, I love shocking twists in wrestling as much as the next fan, but every once in a while, you need a storyline that's straight and to the point. When it starts, you know exactly where it's leading, you know where it's gonna end, and even though it happens, you're still very satisfied. A great example of this would be when the Horsemen turned on Sting at Halloween Havoc in 1995. Another thing about Clash 10. So at this point, even though it was the 10th edition, it still hadn't lost its luster. We still weren't getting main event caliber matches on television. They were filled with squash matches and storyline advancement, which was fine. We didn't know anything different. So these clashes were still really cool. You got to see stuff like the Road Warriors facing the Skyscrapers in what was a dream match. Also on the night, very historic, the Steiners and Doom faced off in a titles versus mask match. The Steiners won. Doom unmasked, shocking no one. It was Ron Simmons and Butch Reed, but it led to them becoming a legitimate tag team. and eventually WCW and WA Tag Team Champions. Um, that being said, Brian Pillman and Tom Zink versus the Mod Squad kind of does balance the ledger out a little bit. But by far, the biggest news of the night was Sting legitimately blowing out his knees. Now, this threw the short-term booking plans out the window. The thing was that Sting was scheduled to meet Flair at Wrestle War, and the idea being floated around is that would be the big night that he would finally win the NWA title. Obviously, the injury led to a change of plans. Now, Wrestle War, despite the booking being all botched up, it's a really good example. It's the first example, actually, of a good show in 1990 being forgotten. Now, before the card even starts, there's the awesome Wrestle War rap that is overshadowed by the Wrestle Rock Rumble. That Wrestle War rap, it's still the template for every freestyle battle I ever enter. Now, the card in and of itself, it's very good. I wouldn't say it's one of the greatest cards of all time, but it does have the Rock and Roll Express against the Midnight Express, so that's guaranteed to be good to great. Plus, you have, I believe that's the card where Cornette first introduced on a national platform the referee shadowboxing spot, which is always good for a chuckle. Brian Pillman and Tom Zink, they defended the U.S. tag belts against the, don't call them the Freebirds. Fun little match. I mean, Jimmy Jam and PSAs can only do so much, but still a nice little match. They had good chemistry. And the Steiners were at their peak during this time, and they were facing a good team in the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. At this time, the Steiners had been tagging together for just a few months, but people were already considering them one of the greatest tag teams of all time. But everything pales in comparison to the main event. Almost 48 minutes. Lex Luger, the U.S. champion, he took Sting's place to wrestle Flair. Flair carried Luger to an amazing match. Now, I'm probably in the minority here, but the match ended in a countdown. But hear me out. I actually don't have a problem with that. I think this is one of those rare cases where a countout works. Now, undoubtedly, the match is way too long for a non-finish. I'm thinking that this had happened because Luger was scheduled to defend the U.S. title against Steve Williams. So once Luger was slotted into the world title match, they canceled the other match, so this one becomes a little bit longer. It's a non-finish. It's almost an hour of your time, and that's a lot of time to invest for a non-conclusion. However, in the context of the story, the ending does make sense. So Luger's facing Flair. Flair is the definite heel. Luger hasn't officially turned, but he's definitely in more of a face role here. He's about to win the world title. He has Flair up in the rack. Uh, Flair is undoubtedly about to submit. Um, During the course of the match, Sting had hobbled down to the ring on his crutches. Now, at this point, the Horsemen start threatening Sting. Uh, Great camera at this time. WWF, they were the industry leaders in pay-per-view production. They had perfected it. However, WCW, they were catching up. They were behind, but they would have these moments. A great moment here, I'll always remember this, is there's a shot kind of from the top of the ramp. The camera's looking down. You have the Horseman kind of menacing Sting. You can see behind them in the ring, Luger's watching this all, and he has Flair up in the rack, and you can tell he has a decision to make. World title, save a friend. A lot of drama. It's really cool. You really don't know what's going to happen, especially when you're a 10-year-old. Luger decides to drop Flair out of the rack, go and save his friend. He ends up being counted out. So even though the ending under most circumstances would not be satisfying, I did enjoy it, especially the post match. Luger's just looking down, very disappointed. He's covered in sweat. He's tired, and you can tell that it's there already. Whether he's second guessing himself, did he make the right decision or not? Now, at this point, I should mention some of the behind the scenes stuff that was going on. Now, in 1990, there was no internet. I had heard of Dave Meltzer, but I didn't need him because I had Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So I really didn't care about all the backstage stuff. So this is kind of what made wrestling a little more fun back then, also. Um, but just for a little context, it is important to know because it affects the year greatly. Um, Olli Anderson is the booker of WCW at this point. Now, anyone who's listened to Olli knows that he's all about making money and he hates Ric Flair. This is the case, in recent years. It was definitely the case in 1990. Oh, Ole was pushing for Flair to drop the NWA World Title. Flair, on the other hand, didn't think Luger was ready to be a tippity top guy, and he had also already promised that he would drop the title to Sting. So he wanted to wait until Sting came back, and then he would continue with plans and then drop the title to him. So there's this kind of back and forth between the two backstage. It never carries out front. I mean, we don't see it out front at first, but it does over the course of the year. We'll see some of the things that happen due to the backstage issues. So the problems carried through March and April. Now, nowadays, a monthly supercard's kind of taken for granted. Yeah, there's the big events, Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, Survivor Series, SummerSlam. They're on a different tier, but every month there is a B level supercard that's being held. Back in 1990, this really wasn't the case. It didn't become the case until the Monday Night Wars, early in the Monday Night Wars, when Eric Bischoff introduced it. But back then, there would be months between big events. But it wasn't the holding pattern that you hear about now. Like right after, there's a holding pattern after WrestleMania. There's a holding pattern between SummerSlam and Royal Rumble. Wasn't the case back then. In between the big cards, there will be matches, there will be feuds, and there will be storylines that would just be built up. It was still must-see television, but it was just leading into the next big event. Now, it's up to individual tastes whether that way is better of doing it or whether you need something every single month. Completely subjective. It probably has to do with when you started watching wrestling, but it is a different style, and it's kind of interesting to see it in retrospect. The fans would never get restless, though. I mean, we would just sit there and watch the stories progress, and then, we'd wait for the next big event. Now, the next big event would come in May. Ole and Flair, they're still continuing to fight backstage. Ole, night after night, he wants Flair to drop the title to Luger. Flair's constantly refusing. He's going to wait on Sting to give him the title. Unfortunately, Sting's return, it's still months away. That leads us to Capital Combat. We will talk about that next time. Thank you for joining A Mark's Eye View.
Hey, homeboy, gather around. Some serious stuff is gonna go down. Gonna wrestle War Daddy, the kings of the ring. All come together and do the wild thing. Lex Luger, the stylish, date your boy Sting. Yeah, they all be doing that. Thing. Yeah, they all be there with something to prove. Brimming with intentions to bust the move. It's pay-per-view excitement for THE. For more information, call your cable company. Wow, 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 wow.